Can you first explain me why anyone should learn Esperanto? Well, that's one of the questions that I found in the comments section of this YouTube channel. So I decided to do a video in English for once and to talk about this question. I think it's an interesting one. I've been spending a few days, as a matter of fact, thinking about this question. Kaj mi esperas che ne ĝenas vin, ke mi nun volas fari YouTuban filmon en la angla, ĉar mi volas respondi al demando. I'm gonna basically ramble along now for a little bit of time, for some time now, because there are several issues that I want to pick up, and the short answer, should anyone learn Esperanto, is no, you shouldn't. Yes, you have heard right. I'm saying this as an Esperanto speaker for many years now. For about 16 years I've been speaking the language, using the language. I'm saying you should not. You want to learn Esperanto. It's not something that you should do, because the word should implies coercion, and it implies somehow that it's a forced way of learning. And that's, I think, not the thing that it should be, the way it should be. And so the short answer is, should anyone learn Esperanto? No. It is something that you do voluntarily because it enriches your life. Just like with many other activities. After all, for me, Esperanto is something that has greatly enriched my life, and that I'm using almost every day. It's kind of interesting. I'm using Esperanto actually way more often than any other language that I've learned in my life, besides German and English, of course, which basically I grew up with these two languages, but otherwise all of the languages I've learned in school. Honestly, so far I've not had a lot of application, because the interesting thing is once you know a language or anything, then you're also going to find an area of application. It's not really a question of the language that you've chosen. It's rather a question of whether you can identify with the language or the thing that you've learned. And then you're also going to be motivated to learn it. Then you're also going to get better at it. And then you're also going to find lots of possibilities to apply the language. And I just want to talk a little bit about maybe my journey. A little bit as an Esperanto speaker and as a teacher, and a few ideas that I have that I did not really respond to yet in other videos, but questions that or answers to questions that keep on kind of reappearing all over the place over the internet, and I simply wants to pick up on these points as well. So it's kind of going to be a little bit of a mix of a of a rambling and a rant maybe, or I don't know, and we'll see how long this is actually where it's gonna take us. I started to learn the language back in the year 2004, so 16 years ago. And I always knew that the language existed because of a friend of my grandmother. She was an Esperanto speaker and preoccupied with the language. I knew it was a language, I knew it was constructed. I didn't know much more about this. And then in 2004, rather by accident, I saw in Wikipedia, on the list of languages, I saw Esperanto. And you know how it's often you see something and you don't recognize it, but all of a sudden I recognize, that's the language I heard about, right? So I immediately started to research a little bit, and the first thing that I came into my mind is, wow, that language is pretty old. 1887. I thought this was, I don't know, a project from the 1950s or 60s. Yeah, so this was the first little surprise. And then immediately I actually decided that's an interesting thing, and I dug into the history a little bit. And I found out it's a very interesting, kind of almost, I would say, also complex history. And I said, that's something I want to learn. So at that time, I had absolutely no idea that there is something like Esperanto organizations around. I had no idea that there are every year Esperanto congresses. I had no idea of that. I simply said, wow, that's an interesting language, a language without exceptions, and a language that someone can learn who really didn't like languages very much during school time. Okay, so I was one of those people who was kind of forced to learn a language, among others, nothing against it, but French. My mother speaks fluent French, also my wife, being a French teacher, but I said, okay, as a European, you got to learn French, right? And so I chose French over Spanish in school. And then the language lost me as soon as we did the numbers, okay? Because it was so illogical to me. And there were so many exceptions that immediately I lost the emotional connection having a computer mind, because I learned programming languages which are extremely structured and systematic and logical. The language simply lost me. And this essentially means, and that's the point why I'm saying this, is is whatever language you learn, it's got to fit your personality and you have to identify with it. And with this language, I simply couldn't identify. I don't regret having learned it a little bit overall, but it was not something that was able to capture my passion. Okay, I know other people where it's exactly the opposite. I mean, yeah, they love the language, they love the sound of the language and all of these things. But for me, with my personality and my background and my mindset, it simply didn't fit me. So essentially, I was kind of glad that school was over. I left, and then I decided, okay, languages, I'm not talented in languages, or I'm not good at it, like many people believe, until many years later, I stumbled across Esperanto, which I immediately said, oh, wow, that's the thing, okay? And sometimes you just know things, you don't have to find a reason or rational justification, you just know it, that's something I want to learn, okay? That fascinates me, okay? So, and that's basically how it all started. And it was like this also, that if you just you go online, of course, there are not so many other possibilities at that time. I mean, there was an Esperanto club in the town, so of course I joined up with them as well. I got a lot of books from there, and learning material was very good. It was very friendly atmosphere. But very soon it was like this, that you start to stumble on the internet across those comments and questions, and all of a sudden you realize, what in the world are they talking about? And I just want to share some of those things that I've read where I don't get it, okay? For example, the criticism of Esperanto, well, it has no culture. Because if you want to learn a language, you have to basically engage in the culture of the language, and it has no culture. There are two responses that kind of didn't make sense to me for two reasons. First of all, Esperanto has a culture. I always thought it has a culture. I mean, if people were put into a concentration camp and killed because they spoke that language, because the language was considered dangerous by dictators, I mean, that's pretty much culture, right? That it was so I didn't really get this. And this other thing is, I mean, I had to learn English. And does it mean when you learn English, you have to embrace the American way of life? The American culture, or the British culture for that sense, if you want to learn English? Is this what you mean? So you see, it didn't make sense. This whole cultural argument didn't really make a lot of sense to me, and it still doesn't. While I do understand, of course, that if you want to speak a language very well, you have to understand the fine nuances of the words and all these things, and that there can be a strong cultural connections. I get all of that. But we see it all the time where people in a different country obtain fluency in the language, and they have never even visited the country. So I never really understood this cultural thing. And another thing, that criticism that I never really understood, is the whole issue about gender. Esperanto is a sexist language, and the reason why they say that is because for some nouns, the base of the noun is assumed to be male, and then you can add a suffix to it and you can make it female. And that's sexist. It's asymmetrical, or it's like an exception. It's supposed that language is not clean. But I mean, that's the argument. I also never really understood this. I mean, there are now so many possibilities, many more possibilities in talking about gender or both genders in Esperanto than there are in other natural, so to say, languages, non-constructed languages. I mean, if you, so there are, it's really these are all criticisms that I really didn't understand very much. So these criticisms really did not deter me very much from learning a language. But one thing that kind of bothered me a little bit, and this is where I'm a little bit critical about the whole thing, is that occasionally there are some folks around, Esperanto speakers, who almost treat this whole language almost like a religion. And this is something where I'm getting a little bit annoyed by, because it shouldn't be. It's a normal language, right? And it's not some kind of but some people are so convinced of this project that I don't know, I sometimes feel it's for some of them almost like a replacement religion or something, right? And that is something that I'm a little bit critical, and I think this is where this argument comes from. Why should I learn Esperanto? Because those folks, they go around and say, you should learn this language. They're so enthusiastic about the project and about the language that they say, you should learn this, right? And I think no, you shouldn't. If you want to learn it, you pick it up. Otherwise, if I tell you to learn something, it doesn't matter what it is, and if you're not convinced, you're not going to learn it anyway, right? If I tell you should learn how to play chess, right? Why? Yeah, because it exercises your mind. I can also do crossword puzzles, right, to exercise my mind, right? So it didn't make sense to me. Another thing I just want to mention is a little bit is about the whole thing. What was another real reason why I started to pick up this language and decided to learn it? And I've been thinking a lot about this, and the answer is it's the value of learning the language itself. There was no higher order reason behind it. It does not help you earn any money. Money for me would be the least important incentive anyway. It is simply because I considered it interesting. I considered it interesting. It's a little bit like this. Why would anyone learn how to play a music instrument? Because it takes a lot of time, it's difficult, and you can just as well buy music from an orchestra, and the music is much better anyway, and you can listen to that. Why do you want to learn how to paint and make a painting? What's the point? I mean, you just go into a gallery and you find better paintings there, right? So so the argument it cannot be that it fulfills a higher order purpose, but it is simply the interest in the language and in the learning process itself, and the feeling, wow, isn't this great? I feel I have learned and understood something now, and you feel things come together, and even if certain grammatical rules don't seem to make sense at the beginning, ultimately I discovered, wow, the guy who invented this, actually they thought about it. He thought about this. This is not arbitrary. I mean, some people say, well, actually, I don't want to learn a constructed language because it's simply the invention of a person. Why should I learn something that somebody invented? It's arbitrary. The rules are arbitrary. And I claim, no, their rules are they're much less arbitrary than, for example, the evolution of a natural language. Where there are where the rules, you try to put rules onto the language because otherwise you cannot even study them, right? Because it evolved in different ways, and that's why there's so many exceptions. So in that sense, I consider that more arbitrary than actually someone sitting down and then actually coming up with the rules, and where you actually then feel that the person actually spent some time thinking about the rules before I actually put it down. So, so all of those arguments that kind of deter other people were actually not really deterrents for me, but I consider this rather a fascinating, a fascinating element. And I did not also, as another reason was, I simply did not want to learn something, that many other people already know. I mean, learning Spanish would have made sense. I actually went to a Spanish course at university, could not really fully identify with the language either. Said, well, why learn Spanish if you can learn Esperanto? I mean, that was kind of my argument a little bit. So for me, it was mostly an emotional connection, and I think that is the thing that I can pass on maybe also to other people, is it doesn't matter what you want to learn. Time is too valuable to spend it on things that you're not really interested in. And I think if you're interested in something, and then you will also get the motivation to actually engage with the subject to a sufficient degree that you also have an easier time learning it. And I think at the beginning question should not be what language should I choose that it can be most useful, but it should be rather with what language to identify myself. I mean, there are people who say, well, as a matter of fact, it would be much better to learn a language that many million people more speak. Even if the language is more difficult, at least you can then talk to many more people. This was never an argument for me. There are enough people worldwide that speak Esperanto. With how many people do you want to talk to? And who says that, I don't know how many billion Chinese people want to talk Mandarin with me? Why would they? So the number of people on the world that speak a particular language really is not for me an incentive to learn that language. I mean, it might be for other people, but for me this wasn't, right? It was actually the interest in the language itself that was a motivating factor. And I think the answer again to your question is, why should anyone learn Esperanto, is because it interests you and because it enriches your life. And that's the bottom line. I think I've rambled along long enough now. Mi nun volas adiaŭi vin kaj ĝis revido, kaj eble estonte mi refoje faros esperantlingvajn filmojn. Ĝis revido.